On to orders of the day. Ordre du jour, the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to move, seconded by the Minister of Public Safety, that in relation to Bill C-42, an Act to amend the Firearms Act and the Criminal Code and to make a related amendment and a consequential amendment to other acts, not more than 2 further sitting days shall be allotted for the consideration and second reading stage of the bill, and that 15 minutes before the expiry of the time provided for government orders on the second day allotted to the consideration at second reading stage of the bill, any proceedings before the House shall be interrupted if required for the purpose of this order, and in turn every question necessary for the disposal of the said stage of the bill shall be put forthwith and successfully without further debate or amendment.
And Lone, seconded by Mr. Blaney, moves that in relation to Bill C-42, an Act to amend the Firearms Act and the Criminal Code and to make a related amendment and a consequential amendment to other acts, not more than 2 further sitting days shall be allotted to the consideration at second reading stage of the bill, and that 15 minutes before the expiry of the time provided for government orders on the second day allotted to the consideration at second reading stage of the said bill, any proceedings before the House shall be interrupted if required for the purpose of this order, and in turn every question necessary for the disposal of the said stage of the bill shall be put forthwith and successively without further debate or amendments. We'll now have a 30-minute question period, and I'll ask members to keep their comments to around about a minute. Questions and government responses to a similar length of time. The Honourable Member for Burnaby, New Westminster.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is the 93rd time in this Parliament that the government has imposed closure and time allocation.
Now the 93rd time that this government has imposed time allocation and closure. They toss it around like it's candy, Mr. Speaker, but there are serious ramifications. First off, of course, in this particular bill, C-42, only 2 members of the opposition have even been able to speak on this because the government basically just sat on it for 4 months. 2 members of the opposition have spoken on it, and now the government is imposing time allocation closure just like that, Mr. Speaker. The other problem, of course, as you know, is that this government has the worst track record in any Canadian government in history in terms of having rejected pieces of legislation. They bring legislation in. They don't subject it to proper debate. They don't allow committees to actually scrutinize that legislation. And then it goes to the courts, Mr. Speaker. And in the last year, 6 pieces of legislation have been thrown out by the courts because the legislation was so badly written up that the courts could simply not stand for it. So the question is very simple. After 2 members of the opposition have spoken on this bill, the government is invoking closure. Why is this government so intolerant of debate, and why do they bring forward legislation that is rejected so consistently by the courts?
Well, Minister of Public Safety.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank my colleague from British Columbia for his question. And to get to the heart of the question, we believe that in the debate that we just had, you referred to the importance of time management in terms of Parliament's work. And I would say, humbly to my colleague, that we already know the position of the main political parties on this bill for the simple and safe registry and transport of firearms. So it's important that we move now to the detailed study of this bill by a committee of parliamentarians who will have the leisure of hearing from all the witnesses they wish to hear from and then to vote. So it's important that we study this bill on the one hand, but that also we look at the reality. We only have a few sitting weeks left, so we need to find the right balance between the parties that have already spoken out and the possibility to move to committee to do a more exhaustive study of the bill.
Questions. The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. All Canadians should be concerned in regards to this majority Conservative government's attitude in terms of a process, ways in which this government has made the determination to process legislation through the House of Commons. Time allocation is something that should be used periodically, Mr. Speaker, if in fact there's a need and a justification for it. Quite often, more often than any other government in the history of our country, we have seen this government abuse the rule of time allocation. For whatever reasons, blame the opposition, do whatever it is that you want. The bottom line is, Mr. Speaker, that the government has failed to be able to properly manage the legislative agenda of the House of Commons, and as a direct result, they have become completely dependent on time allocation. That is not healthy for a democracy in Canada. And my question to the government House Leader is, how does he justify any sense of democracy and respect for this House when he continues to only bring in time allocation in order to be able to get the government agenda across? Because at the end of the day, what you're doing is you're denying Canadians to have their voice heard through their members of Parliament that were duly elected and have the charge, the responsibility of holding government accountable for the legislation that they introduce into the chamber. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Public Safety.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I have the utmost respect for the parliamentary process, Mr. Speaker, and that's why I believe it is now time that this bill, we already know the position of the parties, Mr. Speaker. This bill is about a safe and sensible firearms policy. That's what this bill is all about. There are measures, Mr. Speaker, that will increase the safety of our country, such as mandatory training for anyone who would be willing to acquire or possess a firearm, Mr. Speaker. That's the kind of measure that are in this bill. Now, this is important, Mr. Speaker, that we have a thorough review of that bill, article by article, that we listen to witness. And in our parliamentary process, Mr. Speaker, it is not in this House. It is to send this bill into committee where all parties will be represented, Mr. Speaker, where they can have discussion, where they can look into depth into this bill, Mr. Speaker, and frankly speaking, where there is a less partisan environment sometimes than here in the House of Commons. So these are the good reasons, Mr. Speaker, while that now we already know that the Liberal and the NDP oppose common sense firearms licensing, that we should move this bill into committee, and I'm ready to respond to any
Questions? The Honourable Member for Esquimalt, Wanda Fuca.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You know, I've heard this speech before about going to committee and hearing if everyone wants to appear, and that was on C-51, and we saw what happened with that. So there's a peculiar thing about this bill. The government rushed in here, and we're going to have the bill, and then we had a sudden delay, and suddenly it wasn't on the order paper. So I wondered perhaps if the minister was actually listening to some of the critics of this bill out there. But then a peculiar thing happened, and I want to ask him a very specific question. The Canadian Firearms Association was supposed to appear before the Public Safety Committee on Bill C-51, and they were appearing to speak against that bill. And suddenly, at the very last hour, they withdrew as a witness. So I want to know from the minister, is placing this bill back on the order paper and using time allocation part of a deal that he cut with the Canadian Firearms Association so that they would not testify against C-51, and he agreed, therefore, to bring this forward expeditiously, use time allocation, and pass it through the House? And if so, it's not a deal that I would want to stand up and talk about.
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for his question. It looks like it's April Fool's Day, and I can tell by the question of the member, Mr. Speaker. But there are some people who take whether the issue of counter-terrorism and anti-terrorism measure very seriously, Mr. Speaker, and that's why the Security Committee, Mr. Speaker, heard more than 40 witnesses who were all, for most of them, in support of this important legislation we've passed, Mr. Speaker. But let me get back to the core of the reason why we are now debating, Mr. Speaker, which is the importance to increase the safety and the security while streamlining the process for law-abiding gun owners, Mr. Speaker. And I know there's many in my riding. The name of my riding, as you know, Mr. Speaker, is Belle Chasse, which means nice hunting. But there's also, Mr. Speaker, hunters and fishermen in Yorkton, Melville, in Prince George Peace River, where those members have dedicated a lot of their work and their career at making sure that those who want to possess a firearm do it in a safe way, in a safe manner, but are not being ostracized because they enjoy the outdoor activity, they enjoy fishing, they enjoy, Mr. Speaker, one of the founding activities of this country. So, Mr. Speaker, it's about time.
Questions? The honourable member for Trinity Spadina.
I note with interest that this bill started out as the Common Sense Firearms Act, and now the name's been changed. I'm just curious as to whether or not the common sense has been thrown out the window with it. But the other question I have for the minister is this. With a worldview that sees terrorists around every corner, how are Canadians made more safe by making automatic, semi-automatic weapons easier to get? How are Canadians made safe by making even hunting rifles easier to transport, as well as other firearms easier to transport around this country? And how does the minister respond to the fact that the rifle used in the attack on Parliament Hills was at one point a legally owned gun that got into the hand of a terrorist? Why would he take steps to make guns easier to get if that's the public safety threat he's trying to address the other issues in the House, in front of the House?
L'honorable ministre, pardon.
No, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I invite the honourable member to read the bill, and you will see that there are measures indeed to increase the safety and the use of firearms, Mr. Speaker. And actually, there are measures in that bill that were promoted by the former leader of the NDP, Jack Layton, like the merge of the possession-only license and the possession and acquisition license. So, Mr. Speaker, streamlining, getting a regime of 2 licenses in 1 license, very common sense. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, we will require a mandatory firearm safety courses for first-time gun owners, and they will have to follow the course, Mr. Speaker. We will strengthen firearms prohibition for those who are convicted of domestic violence offences, Mr. Speaker. And this is an important part of that bill, Mr. Speaker. But there are also, Mr. Speaker, ways in that bill to make sure that law-abiding citizens are not treated by criminals because they have forgotten to fill a form in a very short time, Mr. Speaker. So common sense measure. Let's send this bill into committee, Mr. Speaker, so they can review it and get a better understanding. And I invite the member to read the bill. Thank you.
Questions? Honourable Deputy Gatineau.
The honourable member for Gatineau. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A few things the minister said made me jump a little bit. This is the 93rd time allocation motion, and it's a bit ironic that we're talking about time allocation right after we had a colleague attempting to assert the right to speak, so it's a bit ironic. So this is the 93rd time allocation motion. The minister's saying he knows the party's positions. So what's the point of having 308 members here in the House representing various parts of Canada? We all want to express our opinions on a bill or what have you, but the minister saying none of that matters. All we need to know is the party's positions. That's all that interests him. So my specific question for the minister is, I think it a bit odd because only 2 opposition members have had the opportunity so far to speak to this bill. This bill was to be tabled on October 23rd. If it's such a good bill for safety, after what happened in Parliament, why did the government withdraw the bill back then? The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Yes, Mr. Speaker. My honourable colleague knows full well that there have been many opportunities for parliamentarians to be heard. For example, at first reading, at committee, at second reading, at third reading. If it's Parliament's desire, when this comes back to the House, it can be debated some more. But it will have been studied in depth, which it hasn't been yet. I'd just like to remind my colleague that our policies on public safety and arms control are working well. Since 2008, there's been a drop in the armed murder rate, over 30% drop in the armed murder rate. It's one of the lowest rates in 50 years. But we want to keep working along those lines to make the country even safer. And that's why we're going forward with this bill. We're going ahead. and I'd like to meet the committee to explain the merits of this bill.
Melville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a privilege for me to rise and support the minister in Bill C-42. This bill has been around for almost 6 months, and I've been listening very carefully to the debate here, there, and everywhere. No new issues have come up. The only thing that I hear them complaining about is, oh, here's another time allocation motion. But if you've had a bill around and that has not been criticized in the substance of the bill, I see no problem with this. I would like to thank the minister for this, but I would like to point out some of the incorrect things that have even been said today, that this bill somehow makes guns easier to get. That's totally false. That it somehow makes it easier for guns to be transported in Canada. That shows the lack of knowledge of the opposition in regards to this bill, because it doesn't have any effect on it. Most guns are stolen from law-abiding people. How false that statement is. So we have all of these statements that are being made which are completely false. I wonder if the minister has any comment in regards to that.
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for Yorktown, Melville, who has a deep understanding of the way Canadians are abiding by the law. And this is what we're talking. We're talking of a bill that intends to streamline the process for a law-abiding citizen while improving the safety of Canadians with mechanisms that are not there. And I'm a little bit disappointed to see that the member of the opposition would oppose, Mr. Speaker, to remove the license of an individual who's been convicted of domestic violence. This is in the bill, Mr. Speaker. There are measures, Mr. Speaker, that will increase the safety of our citizens, but I will also cut red tape, Mr. Speaker, for a large part of the population that has been taken for too long as a hostage of a mechanism that are actually not safe. And I would like further, Mr. Speaker, to comment on some recent decisions that were made in Quebec and the reaction of some organisms. Thank you.
Questions? The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, the use of time allocation particularly prejudices the rights of members of Parliament in parties of less than 12 members or those who sit as independents, an increasingly growing number along this row. I find it particularly difficult because I just endured, as have other members here, the same minister with the rush through of Bill C-51. When the minister testified to committee, he went out of his way to attack me personally. The chair did not let me respond. I was promised a personal meeting with the minister to discuss C-51. That never occurred. I'm tired of being run over as if there's a tank on the other side that runs over independents and small party members at this side. The Green Party has a right to participate in these debates, and every time there's time allocation, our rights are denied. Please, Mr. Minister, rethink that, Mr. Speaker. Ask the minister to allow us to debate this bill properly.
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I didn't hear any questions, but I certainly would point out to the member that she certainly can take full advantage of our parliamentary process, and that I'm always more than happy to be given opportunity to talk about the measures we are putting forward, whether for countering terrorism. And once again, I'm disappointed to see that the Green Party wouldn't support measures that are reasonable and balanced to protect Canadians. And frankly, Mr. Speaker, I think that we can do both. We can protect Canadians, but we can also protect their privacy, and we can work for the economy, and we can also work, Mr. Speaker, for sustainable development. I'm very proud of having been involved for 20 years in environment. But let me get back to what I just wanted to say, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker, there are two organizations in Quebec that are in favor of effective policies for arms control. And I'm talking about the Federation of Hunters and Trappers and Anglers in Quebec. They say, put in place effective measures. Do not repeat the mistakes of the past, like the expensive and ineffective arms registry. Don't make the mistakes that we experienced in the past, and that's what this bill does, Mr. Speaker. We're correcting those mistakes. We're eliminating paperwork, and we will improve safety and the effectiveness of our arms registration system. Questions and comments?
Member for Toronto Danforth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the justifications the minister has offered is that the time is here to go to committee, even though there's been almost no debate on the bill. Now, in a functioning parliament, in a parliament that actually, where democracy is taken seriously, the idea of going to committee for independent and truly fair review of bills might be something we'd want to entertain, if that argument is made in good faith and sincerely. But we know that that's not true. We had the Minister for Heritage up in the House in QP saying to the Speaker that committees are masters of their own House. Everybody in this House knows that that's not true. That's simply not true. Parliamentary secretaries sit on committees and are the direct conduits of ministers and the PMOs. We also have a record by this government where they will not accept, as a matter of perverse principle, the amendments coming from opposition. There were over 100 amendments from 4 parties or an independents in the C-51 process. Not one was accepted. So going to committee as an excuse to cut off debate in the House is totally bogus, Mr. Speaker, and I'm wondering if the minister somehow or other thinks committees are working independently in this House.
Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Toronto Danforth. Actually, the last time I've entertained a discussion with a member was actually in the Public Safety Committee, Mr. Speaker, discussing the important legislation this government is putting forward on counter-terrorism, Mr. Speaker. And actually, that's more than 40 witnesses, Mr. Speaker. There were witnesses from the leading party, the Conservative Party, and also from the opposition, Mr. Speaker, from the Liberal, from the NDP. And Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the member at this point in time who has spent hours. Actually, last night at 10 o'clock, they were still reviewing the bill after hearing many witnesses, Mr. Speaker, who brought many interesting comments, Mr. Speaker. So for me, that's a clear proof of a committee that has decided to take its job seriously, who've studied the bill for many hours, for extended hours, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, yes, there's a good example, and now we have a result, Mr. Speaker. This bill has been reviewed by a committee and now is ready to come back here and to get back to the Common Sense Firearms Licensing Act. I expect and I hope that the member will support the bill to be sent in second reading and in committee. Thank you.
Questions? The honourable member for Newton North Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to remind all of us what we are hearing, what we are here to debate. What we are actually debating is a time allocation motion. And the reason that many people are trying to get their points made about the legislation during this debate is for the very fact that after 2 speakers, that government has once again moved time allocation to shut down debate. And I actually wasn't planning to get up to speak right now, but it's very difficult to sit here and listen to ministers saying that we need to send the bills to committee where they can have an in-depth study and we can do the hard work, we can have all the amendments. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that's not been my experience. I did not find that when I was on the Immigration Committee and wrong-headed policies were changed. The C-51, a critical bill, I did not get an opportunity to speak on that. And today, I'm ready to speak on this bill, and once again, the other side decides to shut down debate. What are they so scared of?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for speaking, and the member would certainly agree with me that if all members, 307 members, would speak on every bill, on every passage of the bill, Mr. Speaker, we might not accomplish what the people who have put us here are in terms of objective, Mr. Speaker, because they are expecting that we deliver result, Mr. Speaker. And that's why we are working with party line, Mr. Speaker, and we are sharing ideas. Mr. Speaker, the measures in that bill are shared by the member of this government, which is Common Sense Firearms Licensing, a measure streamlining the process, Mr. Speaker, for law-abiding citizens citizens, increasing the security, Mr. Speaker, such as mandatory training, removal of license, Mr. Speaker, for people recognized of domestic violence, Mr. Speaker. And yes, this is democracy at work, Mr. Speaker, and we'll be given the opportunity to vote on that bill, Mr. Speaker, and to send it to committee for a thorough review. And I expect a member who will do their job seriously and review this bill and take it on its merits and not on urban legend or anything else.
Questions? The honourable member for Parkdale High Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you know what my vision of democracy is, where you have people of differing viewpoints who are able to come together and have an open and honest debate, exchange ideas, and goodness gracious, hopefully try to find some middle ground, maybe find a little bit of compromise, listening to each other, and making the very best decisions for the people they represent. Surely that's the aspiration that we have when we come to this House. We're dealing with a bill that is extremely important, firearms safety. I come from the largest city in the country, where we have young people dying of gunshot wounds. We have families torn apart because of gun violence. It's a serious issue. I know there are strong views on gun safety, differing views from all across the country. And I think the best way to find good legislation is by listening to people on all sides of the issue and trying to find common ground and the best result. And so my question to the minister is, what's the panic on this bill? Why aren't members being allowed to debate it? Why the offense to fundamental democracy? Why shutting down debate in this place for the 93rd time? What are they afraid of? Why don't they let us debate this bill?
Minister of Public Safety.
Well, I thank the member for a question, Mr. Speaker, and frankly, indeed, we've been listening, Mr. Speaker, of a regime that has been put in place many decades ago, and that need improvement, Mr. Speaker. And I put to you that this bill is bringing common sense into a regime that has been a lot of paperwork for law-abiding citizens, and also that has been having weaknesses in terms of the safety of the community and of the urban community she's been referring to. So, Mr. Speaker, once again, I put to you that by having a mandatory training for anyone who's willing to possess or acquire a firearm in Canada, we are strengthening our Canadian way of dealing with the firearms. And I also put to you that if someone has been convicted of domestic violence, this individual should not have the capacity to possess a firearm. These are the measures in this bill, Mr. Speaker, along with other measures to streamline the process and treat with respect those who are abiding by the law. So, Mr. Speaker, indeed, we have nothing to hide. We're just proud. The bill is up there, up for debate. Let's get it through committee so we can review this bill with the people and have witnessed.
I thank honourable members for their participation in limiting their interventions this afternoon. We have time for about 2 more interventions, and then that will wrap up the 30 minutes. The honourable member for Esquimalt, Wanda Fuca.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What we heard from the minister, again, was very disingenuous when he talks about what if all 307 of us spoke. What we're talking about is the government limiting the speaking to 2, not 300, but only 2 members having spoken. And when he talks again about the committees being master of their own house, we know that the Parliamentary Secretary for Public Safety speaks for the minister in the House. That's their job. But unfortunately, when she comes to the committee, she does the same thing and speaks for the minister. And so the initial proposal from the Parliamentary Secretary was that we only have 3 meetings and we only have 18 witnesses. And only because the NDP did a filibuster under the rules did we force the government to allow more witnesses. We only heard 48 of the more than 100 people who wanted to appear. But I want to go back to my question. This bill had been taken off the order paper. Suddenly it appeared back on the order paper, and now suddenly we have time allocation. The minister evaded my question. Is this part of a deal he struck with the Canadian Firearms Association to get them to drop out of the witness list on C-51 and to not criticize Bill C-51, which he knows very well they were going to do?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the committee are are master of their own destiny. They listen to who they want to listen to, who they don't want to listen to. Members are invited, some witnesses are invited, some agree, some don't agree. It's up to committee, Mr. Speaker. What I can tell you is I've been speaking to many Canadians across the country, many organisms, Mr. Speaker, and they certainly welcome those measures, Mr. Speaker. Once again, I'm really proud of this mandatory training for everyone. This is a great improvement, and I'm sure the member will appreciate this measure, such as the domestic violence. I get back to this, Mr. Speaker, and also a measure I haven't had time to speak today, but this is about making sure that when there are firearms that are imported in this country, Mr. Speaker, we will make it mandatory for the RCMP to exchange information with the CBSA so there are no gaps that could be exploited by criminals, Mr. Speaker. Strong measures to strengthen our licensing regime, Mr. Speaker, but also, and I insist on that, streamlining the process for law-abiding citizens. Thank you.
La dernière question, the honourable member.
The last question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And what we just got here was an admission by the minister that there was a deal, no question about it, that they would actually take this bill and put time allocation on it and speed it through. And the deal was that the Firearms Association would actually stand down from, yeah, absolutely, caught red-handed, would stand down on Bill C-51. So time allocation, the 93rd time, is it? 93rd time that this government has abused democracy was about a deal cut between this government and this minister and the firearms lobby of this country. It's a sad, sad day for democracy when you bring in time allocation 93 times, but it's abhorrent when you do it when you're cutting a deal with the lobby group. So can the minister get up and tell us whether or not he cut a deal, yes or no?
Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, encore une fois, Monsieur le Président, c'est vraiment...
Well, once again, Mr. Speaker, this is an April Fool's joke that we're hearing again and again, Mr. Speaker. On the contrary, I think that members have an opportunity to speak to this bill at second reading and to take it to committee so that at committee we can review it in all its aspects, point by point, so that someone who is found guilty of domestic violence no longer has the right to acquire or possess a firearm. Then the issue of mandatory training, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we want to work with the opposition parties, with Canadian society, to have a regime for firearms that is safe and that simplifies the system for law-abiding citizens. It encourages an industry that we're proud of, that's part of our heritage and our history, hunting and fishing, and sports shooting. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
This will bring the 30-minute period or questions to a close. But before we get to the question, it's my duty, pursuant to Standing Order 38, to inform the House that the questions to be raised tonight at the time of adjournment are as follows. The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands in respect to public safety, and the Honourable Member for Thunder Bay Superior North in respect to the environment. And now it's my duty to interrupt the proceedings at this time and put forthwith the question on the motion now before the House. Mr. Van Loan, seconded by Mr. Blaney, moved that in relation to Bill C-42, an act to amend the Firearms Act and the Criminal Code, and to make a related amendment and a consequential amendment to other acts, not more than 2 further sitting days shall be allotted to the consideration of the second reading stage of the bill, and que 15 minutes avant l'expiration.
That 15 minutes before the expiry of the time provided for government orders on the second day allotted to the consideration at second reading. Any deliberations before the House shall be interrupted, if required for the purpose of this order, and in turn every question necessary for the disposal of the stage of the bill then under consideration shall be put forthwith and successively without further debate or amendment.
Adopt the motion. All those in favor of the motion will please say yea. Yay. All those opposed will please say nay. Nay. In my opinion, the nays have it. Call in the members. Order. Alors, la question est la...
The question is the following one. Mr. Van Loan, seconded by Mr. Blaney, moved that in relation to Bill C-42, an act to amend the Firearms Act and the Criminal Code, and to make a related amendment and a consequential amendment to other acts, not more than 2 further sitting days shall be allotted to the consideration of the second reading stage of the bill, and
that 15 minutes before the expiry of the time provided for government orders on the second day allotted to the consideration at second reading stage of the said bill, any proceedings before the House shall be interrupted if required for the purposes of this order, and in turn, every question necessary for the disposal of the said stage of the bill shall be put forthwith and successively without further debate or amendment. All those in favor of the motion will please rise.
Mr. Van Loan.
Mr. Van Loan.
Mr. Fletcher.
Mr. Fletcher.
Ms. Leach.
Ms. Leach.
Mr. Fantino.
Mr. Fantino.
Mr. Valcourt.
Mr. Valcourt.
Mr. Blaney.
Mr. Blaney.
Ms. Finley Haldeman Norfolk.
Ms. Finley Haldeman Norfolk.
Mr. Nicholson.
Mr. Nicholson.
Mr. McKay Central Nova.
Mr. McKay Central Nova.
Mr. Clement.
Mr. Clement.
Mr. Paradis.
Mr. Paradis.
Mr. Ritz.
Mr. Ritz.
Mr. Kenny Calgary Southeast.
Mr. Kenny Calgary Southeast.
Mr. Moore, Port Moody, Westwood, Poco Quitlam.
Mr. Moore, Port Moody, Westwood, Poco Quitlam.
Mrs. Aglukac.
Mrs. Aglukac.
Mrs. Shea.
Mrs. Shea.
Mr. Fass.
Mr. Fass.
Ms. Ambrose.
Ms. Ambrose.
Ms. Raitt.
Ms. Raitt.
Ms. Finley, Dr. Richmond East.
Ms. Finley, Delta Richmond
Mr. O'Toole.
East. Mr. O'Toole.
Mr. Poiliev.
Mr. Poilier.
Mr. Brightcrate.
Mr. Brightcrate.
Mr. Hahn.
Mr. Hahn.
Mr. Chung.
Mr. Chung.
Mrs. Troupe.
Mrs. Troupe.
Mr. Dykstra.
Mr. Dykstra.
Mr. Gould.
Mr. Gould.
Mr. Morfundy Royal.
Mr. Morfundy Royal.
Mr. Goodyear.
Mr. Goodyear.
Mr. Gosal.
Mr. Gassal.
Ms. Rempel.
Ms. Rempel.
Mr. Duncan Vancouver Island North.
Mr. Duncan Vancouver Island North.
Mrs. Yelich.
Mrs. Yelich.
Mrs. Wong.
Mrs. Wong.
Ms. Bergen.
Ms. Bergen.
Mr. Upal.
Mr. Upal.
Mr. Holder.
Mr. Holder.
Mr. Lake.
Mr. Lake.
Mr. Anderson.
Mr. Anderson.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Campbell Meadows Maple Ridge Mission.
Mr. Campbell Meadows Maple Ridge Mission.
Mr. Keddy South Shore St. Margaret.
Mr. Keddy South Shore St. Margaret.
Mrs. Abloncy.
Mrs. Abloncy.
Mr. Kent.
Mr. Kent.
Mr. Cannon.
Mr. Cannon.
Mr. Rajat.
Mr. Rajat.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Goldring.
Mr. Goldring.
Mrs. Greywall.
Mrs. Greywall.
Mr. Albert.
Mr. Albert.
Mr. Straw.
Mr. Straw.
Mr. Trottier.
Mr. Trottier.
Mr. Watson.
Mr. Watson.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Saxton.
Mr. Saxton.
Mr. Calandra.
Mr. Calandra.
Mr. Lukiski.
Mr. Lukiski.
Mr. Braid.
Mr. Braid.
Mr. Gill.
Mr. Gill.
Miss James.
Ms. James.
Mrs. McLeod.
Mrs. McLeod.
Mr. Leon.
Mr. Leon.
Miss Brownie Market Aurora.
Ms. Brownie Market Aurora.
Mr. Lemieux.
Mr. Lemieux.
Mr. Armstrong.
Mr. Armstrong.
Mr. Menegakis.
Mr. Menegakis.
Mr. Warkington.
Mr. Warkington.
Mrs. Smith.
Mrs. Smith.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Schellenberger.
Mr. Schellenberger.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Brownlees Granville.
Mr. Brownlees Granville.
Mr. Anders.
Mr. Anders.
Mr. Lozon.
Mr. Lozon.
Mr. Hebert.
Mr. Hebert.
Mr. Shorey.
Mr. Shorey.
Mr. Komarnicki.
Mr. Komarnicki.
Mr. Crampton Edward Hastings.
Mr. Crampton Edward Hastings.
Mr. Tilson.
Mr. Tilson.
Mr. Trost.
Mr. Trost.
Mr. Warwa.
Mr. Warwa.
Mr. Albrecht.
Mr. Albrecht.
Mr. McKenzie.
Mr. McKenzie.
Mrs. Davidson.
Mrs. Davidson.
Mr. Getty-Pope.
Mr. Getty-Pope.
Mr. Mays.
Mr. Mays.
Mr. Norlock.
Mr. Norlock.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Storseth.
Mr. Storseth.
Mr. Sweet.
Mr. Sweet.
Mr. Wallace.
Mr. Wallace.
Mr. Clark.
Mr. Clark.
Mr. Bowen.
Mr. Bowen.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Hobach.
Mr. Hobach.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. McColman.
Mr. McColman.
Mr. Woodworth.
Mr. Woodworth.
Mr. Adler.
Mr. Adler.
Mr. Harris Scarborough Prince George.
Mr. Harris Scarborough Prince George.
Mr. Preston.
Mr. Preston.
Mr. Alan Tobic McNaquah.
Mr. Alan Tobic McNaquah.
Mrs. O'Neill Gordon.
Mrs. O'Neill Gordon.
Mr. Payne.
Mr. Payne.
Mr. Weston, West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country.
Mr. Weston, West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country.
Mr. Weston St. John.
Mr. Weston St. John.
Mr. Young Oakville.
Mr. Young Oakville.
Mr. Sopa.
Mr. Sopa.
Mrs. Ambler.
Mrs. Ambler.
Mr. Aspen.
Mr. Aspen.
Madame Bateman.
Madame Bateman.
Mr. Butt.
Mr. Butt.
Mr. Carmichael.
Mr. Carmichael.
Mr. Chisu.
Mr. Chizu.
Mr. Daniel.
Mr. Daniel.
Mr. Leaf.
Mr. Leaf.
Mr. Lizon.
Mr. Lizon.
Mr. Opitz.
Mr. Opitz.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Tote.
Mr. Tote.
Mr. Wilkes.
Mr. Wilkes.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Miss Young Vancouver South.
Miss Young Vancouver South.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Miss Crockett.
Ms. Crockett.
Mr. Hayes.
Mr. Hayes.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Falk.
Mr. Falk.
Mr. Yerdega.
Mr. Yerdega.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. DeVolen.
Mr. DeVolen.
Mrs. Perkins.
Mrs. Perkins.
Mr. Iglinski.
Mr. Iglinski. All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Mr. Martin.
Mr. Martin.
Madame Laverdière.
Madame Laverdière.
Ms. Sims Newton North Delta.
Ms. Sims Newton North Delta.
Mr. Alan Wellen.
Mr. Alan Wellen.
Ms. Duncan Edmonton Strathcona.
Ms. Duncan Edmonton Strathcona.
Mr. Dewar.
Mr. Dewar.
Mr. Harris St. John.
Mr. Harris St. John.
Madame Boivin.
Madame Boivin.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Ms. Leslie.
Ms. Leslie.
Mr. Christofferson.
Mr. Christofferson.
Ms. Nash.
Ms. Nash.
Mr. Cullen.
Mr. Cullen.
Ms. Ashton.
Ms. Ashton.
Mr. Davies Vancouver Kingsway.
Mr. Davis Vancouver Kingsway.
Ms. Matheson.
Ms. Matheson.
Madame Boutin-Sweet.
Madame Boutin-Sweet.
Monsieur Godin.
Monsieur Godin.
Mr. Bevington.
Mr. Bevington.
Monsieur Maille.
Monsieur Maille.
Madame D.
Madame Day.
Mr. Scott.
Mr. Scott.
Mr. Kelway.
Mr. Kelway.
Madame Brosseau.
Madame Brosseau.
Monsieur Toon.
Monsieur Toon.
Madame Turmel.
Madame Turmel.
Madame Grosguet.
Madame Grosguet.
Mr. Chisholm.
Mr. Chisholm.
Monsieur Boulris.
Monsieur Boulris.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Marston.
Mr. Marston.
Madame Hughes.
Madame Hughes.
Mr. Caron.
Monsieur Caron.
Mr. Rafferty.
Mr. Rafferty.
Ms. Crowder.
Ms. Crowder.
Ms. Charlton.
Ms. Charlton.
Monsieur Giguère.
Monsieur Giguère.
Madame Ayala.
Madame Ayala.
Mr. Sullivan.
Mr. Sullivan.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Madame Papillon.
Madame Papillon.
Monsieur Aubin.
Monsieur Aubin.
Monsieur Dubé.
Monsieur Dubé.
Madame Blanchette-Lamotte.
Madame Blanchette-Lamotte.
Madame Leblanc-Lassalémar.
Madame Leblanc, la Salamar.
Monsieur Saganache.
Monsieur Saganache.
Monsieur Nantel.
Monsieur Nantel.
Madame Piclet.
Madame Peclet.
Monsieur Gravel.
Monsieur Gravel.
Madame Michaud.
Madame Michaud.
Monsieur Blanchette.
Monsieur Blanchette.
Monsieur Harris Scarborough Southwest.
Mr. Harris Scarborough Southwest.
Monsieur Bramy.
Monsieur Bramy.
Monsieur Rousseau.
Monsieur Rousseau.
Monsieur Genet-Jourdain.
Monsieur Genet-Jourdain.
Monsieur Lapointe.
Monsieur Lapointe.
Monsieur Côté.
Monsieur Côté.
Monsieur Dussault.
Monsieur Dussault.
Monsieur Choquette.
Monsieur Choquette.
Mr. Sandou.
Mr. Sandou.
Madame Sella.
Madame Sella.
Monsieur Dionabel.
Monsieur Dion Labelle.
Madame Freeman.
Madame Freeman.
Mrs. Sabaïsen.
Mrs. Sabaïsen.
Madame Dory Lefebvre.
Madame Dora Lefebvre.
Madame Quash.
Madame Quash.
Madame Borg.
Madame Borg.
Monsieur Nichols.
Monsieur Nichols.
Madame Moore, Abitibi-Témiscamingue.
Madame Moore, Abitibi-Témiscamingue.
Madame Latendresse.
Madame Latendresse.
Mr. Cromartin.
Mr. Cromartin.
Madame Morin-Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte.
Madame Morin Saint-Hyacinthe.
Monsieur Nunez-Mélo.
Monsieur Nunez-Mélo.
Monsieur Tremblay.
Monsieur Tremblay.
Monsieur Pilon.
Monsieur Pilon.
Monsieur Genet.
Monsieur Genet.
Monsieur Chicoine.
Monsieur Chicoine.
Monsieur Morin-Chicoutimi-Fiard.
Monsieur Morin Chicoutimi-Lafiard.
Madame Lou.
Madame Lou.
Madame Morin, Notre-Dame-de-Grâce, La Chine.
Madame Morin, Notre-Dame-de-Grâce, La Chine.
Mr. Benskin.
Mr. Benskin.
Monsieur Morin, Laurentide-Labelle.
Monsieur Morin, Laurentide-Labelle.
Monsieur Trudeau.
Monsieur Trudeau.
Mr. Macaulay.
Mr. Macaulay.
Mr. Goodale.
Mr. Goodale.
Monsieur Leblanc-Beauséjour.
Monsieur Leblanc-Beauséjour.
Mr. Easter.
Mr. Easter.
Ms. Fry.
Ms. Fry.
Mr. Regan.
Mr. Regan.
Mr. Burns.
Mr. Burns.
Ms. Foote.
Ms. Foote.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Monsieur Dion.
Mr. Dion.
Ms. Gros.
Ms. Grove.
Ms. Bennett.
Ms. Bennett.
Mr. Bryson.
Mr. Bryson.
Mr. Cutler.
Mr. Cutler.
Mr. McKay Scarborough Guildwood.
Mr. McKay Scarborough Guildwood.
Mr. Cusner.
Mr. Cusner.
Mr. Eiking.
Mr. Eiking.
Mr. McCallum.
Mr. McCallum.
Mr. Scarpeligia.
Mr. Scarpeligia.
Ms. Duncan Etobicoke North.
Ms. Duncan Etobicoke
Ms.
North.
Murray.
Ms. Murray.
Mr. Sims, Bonavista, Gander, Grand Falls, Windsor.
Mr. Sims, Bonavista, Gander, Grand Falls, Windsor.
Madame Saint-Denis.
Madame Saint-Denis.
Monsieur Garneau.
Monsieur Garneau.
Ms. Adams.
Ms. Adams.
Mr. Chou.
Mr. Chou.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Monsieur Dubourg.
Monsieur Dubourg.
Ms. Freeland.
Ms. Freeland.
Ms. Jones.
Ms. Jones.
Mr. Vaughn.
Mr. Vaughn.
Mr. Pichetti.
Mr. Pachetti.
Monsieur Plamondon.
Monsieur Plamondon.
Mr. Rathgaber.
Mr. Rathgaber.
Mr. Heyer.
Mr. Heyer.
Ms. May.
Ms. May.
Madame Perrault.
Madame Perrault.
Yeas pour, 134, 134. Nays contre, 122, 122.
Je déclare la motion adoptée.
I declare the motion carried.
Je désire informer la Chambre qu'une raison.
I wish to inform the House that due to the time allocation motion, the time for government orders will be extended by 30 minutes.
Government orders, government bills coming. Reprise du débat en deuxième lecture du projet.
Resuming debate at second reading on Bill C-42, an act to amend the Firearms Act and the Criminal Code.
Order. When the House last took up debate on the motion, the Honourable Member for Yorkton Melville had 5 minutes remaining for his comments, and that will, of course, be followed by 5 minutes for questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Yorkton Melville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I just want to continue from where I left off quite some time ago. This bill has been before the House for quite some time, and so people may not remember those comments, but I invite them to look them up in Hansard. The changes that are being made here in Bill C-42 show just how serious we are about improving public safety and keeping the public safe from real threats, rather than simply trying to take guns out of the hands of hunters and sport shooters. There are types of common sense measures that are important to bring forward. They keep the public safe without putting needless barriers on law-abiding Canadians, and that's the main point that I want to continue to make. I'd like to address one of the colossal problems that has been raised in the firearms community, and that has a direct impact on thousands of law-abiding gun owners. In February of 2014, overnight, and by the mere stroke of a bureaucrat's pen, thousands of law-abiding gun owners became criminals. Without taking any action on their own at all, thousands of Canadians were unwittingly, potentially the subject of criminal charges that came with a mandatory 3-year prison sentence. And I'm of course talking about the reclassification of the CZ-858 and the Swiss Arms family of rifles. Our government took swift and decisive action at that time to condemn this nonsensical decision and to put in place measures to allow people to use their property and to protect them from prosecution. However, at the end of the day, individuals who own the impacted rifles were still in legal limbo. Their ability to use their property varies across the country. Their ability to sell their own property was halted. They could not even plan for the future use of their asset, given the amnesty that had an expiration date. Now, this legislation will end arbitrary reclassifications once and for all. For the first time, the elected government will have oversight of classification decisions. On the advice of outside experts, elected officials will be able to overturn incorrect decisions. Additionally, once this bill receives royal assent, the impacted rifles will have their original classification status restored. Mr. Speaker, it's clear that these measures are safe and sensible, as everything else in the bill is. While the bill is by no means a panacea for all responsible gun owners, many think it's a good start, including me. I know there are MPs in all political parties who support Canadian heritage activities that include hunting and sport shooting, and it is my sincere hope that those members, regardless of their political affiliation, will support this legislation. It'll save money and focus on fighting crime. If we listen to the experts who agree, the paperwork does not stop crime. I'd like to make a few other additional comments. Those who oppose this legislation are never able to explain what they are advocating will ever reduce crime. For example, there was a lot of talk about the gun registry when it was abolished. It would, violate public safety, increase crime, all those kinds of things. Murders using long guns, that's rifles and shotguns, have steadily declined since the registry was abolished. If $2 billion had not been wasted, but rather invested in measures that could improve public safety, we could have truly saved lives. For example, if we had a stronger police presence in some areas of our cities, that would be effective. We need to promote healthy outdoor sport activities for the youth of Canada. That's healthy and good for them. I'd also like to point out that many people on the opposition side use the term gun control, and they somehow equate it to public safety, but they never explain how it will improve public safety. And the one thing that they can never explain is how, if you lay a piece of paper beside a firearm, it's somehow going to control what criminals do with that firearm. It doesn't make sense. We are bringing in common sense firearms laws. That's what needs to be done. We look back in history, we can see that all the criticism that the long gun registry received was valid, and we changed that, and crime did not increase. In fact, crime with firearms decreased. I look forward to questions and comments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. Question commentaire. The honourable member for York South-Weston.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I noted with interest the member opposite's suggestion that this has been before the House for a lot of time. It hasn't actually been before the House for a lot of time. It was stalled by this government for some considerable period of time, and then, surprise, they want it back, and they want it back in a hurry. And without the proper debate is the problem, Mr. Speaker. But in light of that, the member talks about public safety. In my riding of York South-Weston, public safety isn't going to be affected by anything this government has done, because the public safety that needs to be done is the stop of handguns at the border, Mr. Speaker. And because even in grade 10 classes that I go to, half the kids there either have a handgun or know someone who has one. That's an astounding amount of people, and I wonder what this government intends to do to stop the flow of handguns at the border, because so far they have not managed to protect the people of my riding.
The honourable member for Yorkton Melville.
I'm glad to hear that the member has admitted that it's illegal handguns that are the problem. When we were last debating this several months ago, the opposition made the point that most of the guns that are used in crime come from law-abiding citizens because they've been stolen from them. Finally, he admits that we've got to put more resources into stopping the flow of illegal guns. 90% of the firearms that are involved in crime in Toronto, where he is from, are illegally owned. They're not registered. We've had a handgun registry since 1934. If we would have used the $2 billion that was wasted on the gun registry and started putting that into police resources to enforce the laws we have, we would be much safer right now. This is the point the opposition often misses.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to share with the member a comment that was in the Globe and Mail back on December the 4th. And the interesting thing about the comment is that it's actually coming from a representative of the National Firearms Association. And I quote where it states that while there are aspects of the bill that may be helpful, it's really tinkering with a failed system. NFA President Sheldon Clare said in an interview later suggesting the bill seems designed more as a political fundraising effort. Quote, the Conservative bill really isn't a problem-solving bill. It's a pre-election. You know, we're trying to tinker with this and give us some money bill. Mr. Speaker, there is a fair concern that many out there believe that this is just the Conservative Party playing with an important issue in order to try to cater to a certain groups and possibly generate money. I'm wondering how the member would respond to that very serious allegation, given that we are only months away now from an election.
Member for Yorkton Melville.
It's interesting that the only comments they can make are not related to the bill. We're here today to talk about C-42. Why can't the member come up with some issues that concern C-42 rather than some extraneous thing that I haven't even read and asking me to comment on it? These are common sense firearms measures. If the member agrees with that, I hope he will support us. If he doesn't, how about some substantial criticism of the bill?
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Kootenay, Columbia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and maybe I can help the member out by asking him. Maybe he could tell this House how important it is to amalgamate the POW and the POL together, so that people that possess firearms will be better able to move and acquire firearms.
You're here.
One member for Yorkton Melville.
Thank you. Excellent question, finally. Let me explain to those who are watching and may not know what a PAL and a POL are. A license to acquire firearms is a PAL, P-A-L. P-O-L is a license to simply own them and not to acquire any others. We are going to amalgamate that. That's going to simplify the paperwork. People who have had a P-O-L for 8 years have proved them to be safe. Why not put that into one license? It'll simplify the paperwork, reduce the bureaucracy, and save the government money. Common sense.
Please, the debate.
Resuming debate. The honourable member for Gatineau.
Of the member for Yorktown, Melville, is going to be quite the challenge for me, that's for sure. Vous savez, Monsieur le Président, oui, je vais y dire.
You know, Mr. Speaker, I'll make an effort. What really busts me up in the debate about firearms in Canada ever since I was elected to this parliament. What busts me up is how such an important issue, and regardless of what party you're from, but this is an important issue for public safety and for a lot of Canadians. My friends opposite always pretend that they call them law-abiding citizens, law-abiding hunters, and so on, as if we weren't law-abiding or as if we didn't care about law-abiding citizens. They depict us as being anti-hunting, against everything that's directly or indirectly related to firearms or any type of weapon. But as official opposition justice critic, and like all my colleagues in the NDP caucus, we want to try to take that out of the debate, that bitterly partisan approach. Often the government tries to act like they are the only virtuous ones. They use the firearms registry to try to divide Canadians, divide between hunters and criminals, between rural and urban, to pit people against one another. They use those arguments. And well, I'm from Quebec. I was born in Quebec, so the Polytechnique, the Montreal Massacre, that's a fact of life. That's something that comes up every year when there are events to commemorate that massacre. It was a horrible tragedy. And the Dawson College shooting as well. These are facts of life for Quebecers. Terrible things. And then there was October 22nd. Imagine, there was also a shooter in the Quebec National Assembly. This guy that went into the Quebec Assembly and started shooting the place up. So these are all parts of our reality, and these are things that make people a bit sensitive to the issue of firearms. But this government, with bill after bill and fundraiser after fundraiser, they try to use this as a wedge issue, something so fundamentally personal for a lot of people. So it's obvious that at times it becomes difficult to even imagine that there's any basis for this legislation, that there's any good intentions, any goodwill behind it, because of the way this government has acted. Even the Prime Minister, way back when, voted in favor of the firearms registry. So let's not forget history. I think all too often we tend to forget about historical facts.
Now, let's think back to the reasons why the registry was created in the first place. Now, everyone's going to say, well, we're not here to talk about the registry, but there is a guiding thread, and I want to speak to it. The events that occurred at the Polytechnique in Montreal are something we're all familiar with. I wasn't there myself, but as a Canadian and a Quebecer who went through those difficult times in the province, a horrific incident, we saw the political groups react and put something in place in response. Now, was the registry created by the Liberals? Was it put together properly? Was it a good thing? Well, as the member for Yorktown Melville, and I hope I'm not mistaken in who said this, but he talked about creating an impression. And so they always say that the people who wanted to put in place the registry, they wanted to criminalize hunters without taking into account the victims from the 1990s. Now, if we take the time to take a deep breath, to look at the situation and look beyond what various caucuses have done on highly emotional issues and on such an important issue for others who live in communities that are perhaps not Gatineau, like my riding, but some people here like to call us anti-this, anti-that, whatever. I'm very pleased myself, Mr. Speaker, to sit down with my Gatineau Hunters and Fishers Association. As I said to someone, if you think that I live eating tofu if I've gotten this big eating tofu. Well, no, it's not the case, and I'm not anti-hunting and fishing, Mr. Speaker. But what I've always advocated is public safety for the people of this country. Now, we have a government that has brought in legislation that boasts about public safety and says that on our side we don't want to take the measures necessary. And then they come forth with a number of measures where they destroy the data, and I'm referring to the registry, data that the federal government doesn't even need. And it took a really narrow-minded group of people, contemptuous people, to say, well, if I'm not going to use that data, you're not going to have it either. And that's what happened. The Supreme Court said you have the legal right to eliminate the data, but politically, and it was a political choice that you're making, you'll pay the price that goes with that. And it's clearly stated in the decision from the court. It's a decision of the federal government. It was made solely to hinder the provinces. Now, as I've often said, if the government is proud here to say that they've made a decision that would have adverse effects on a partner in the Federation, well, we have a serious problem with our Federation in this country, and that would be very regrettable. Now, having said that, under Bill C-42, and when we look at everything the federal government has done under the government, the Prime Minister, the types of speeches that we hear, the fundraising campaigns among their grassroots supporters, etc. And I'm not saying anything about people who are involved in that kind of lobbying. That's their job. But it's our job as parliamentarians to not allow ourselves to be trampled on because we don't share the same ideas. Now, there are some people who are claiming that no one should have a firearm of any type. Well, I would sit down with that person as well, listen to their comments, and try to make a common sense decision. Now, there are problems here, problems at customs when people cross the border. There are black markets for weapons, Mr. Speaker. And I'm not talking about hunters here. I'm talking about organized crime. They sell weapons, and, well, we argue over certain things. We're not looking at other important aspects, and budgets are being cut to the budgets that try to deal with those kinds of crimes that I've mentioned. Now, it's not acceptable for the government to say that all we're simply here to do is to prevent hunters and fishers from doing what they want to. There are also rights for Aboriginal peoples, their inherent rights, the right to hunt, and no one wants to take that away either. There are some measures in Bill C-42, Mr. Speaker, that make me doubt that it will create serious problems for First Nations. It might infringe upon some of their rights, but the Conservatives haven't talked about that. They haven't taken a stand against that kind of situation. No, all they've said is C-42, because it's government legislation, it must be absolutely extraordinary. Now, each time I talk about a bill, I look at the short titles. And the short titles, Mr. Speaker, are always interesting. Someone must be paid in the Conservative Party just to sit down and draft these short titles, because they've certainly got a lot of imagination. Sometimes they have more imagination in French than in English. And it's so interesting when you look at Bill C-42, because if you look on the English side, it says
the Common Sense Firearms Licensing Act. Common Sense Firearms Licensing Act. Ça, c'est le mot.
So that's the wording that people outside of this area love. That so pleases the supporters of people in rural areas. But if we look at the French, and it says an act governing the simple and safe delivery of firearms licenses. So it talks about safety, not common sense. Now, this is something that they're trying to, a message they're trying to put through in Quebec. Now, the problem with the Conservative government is always their recipe for pudding that is such that when it comes to their credibility, and my mom always said this when I was little, they say I cried wolf too often and they don't believe me, but that's what we're seeing from the government here with their so-called law and order agenda, their conservative law and order agenda. Now it's a public safety and security agenda, or the fact that we're sending our men and women into war in Iraq and Syria. They've said too many things and the opposite, and so no one believes them anymore. And so when we no longer believe them, we can't stand up and support something. Now, taking away the red tape, the useless bureaucracy, that's not a problem. Ensuring that someone who has a hunting rifle, for example, that who uses it for hunting, that stores it properly, although there are other pieces of legislation, people who want to change the legislation with respect to storage, but when you look at all of this, maybe we're going to end up back in a situation where if you're 50 or 75 kilometers from a larger urban center, you'll be entitled to have a firearm. That's not what Canadians want. Now, having said that, I don't want people who live legally, who are law-abiding citizens, who hunt. I don't want to prevent them from doing that. I go to cadet ceremonies. I'm so proud of the Cadet Corps in Gatineau. When I see them win the firing competitions, I'm pretty sure that they're not using Nintendo guns for those competitions. So stop thinking people are fools. What we're talking about here is being cautious and careful. We want to ensure that the measures we adopt make sense. Now, there are some measures, Mr. Speaker, in this bill that are worrisome. And maybe it's because it's not drafted properly, and maybe I'm not sure if we'll be able to correct it or remedy it at committee, because when you look at the number of members who sit on that committee and the number of times I've heard the parliamentary secretary say, well, they're doing what they've been asked to do, well, I have no doubt in my mind. I know full well that they've got a mission and they're doing the job that the higher powers have asked them to carry out at committee. And even when they say in the hallways that what others have said makes good sense, but they can't support it, well, they can't come here. The ministers can't come here and say that committees are masters of their own proceedings. Now, even if we're the party of hope and optimism, I think that I remain very optimist, and as regards committee proceedings, our hope is it's been set back somewhat. But for people who live in rural areas, for example, there may not be a trainer to provide training. That's something that the committee will have to take a look at carefully. On the issue of First Nations, I hope that there will be some witnesses from First Nations communities who will have an opportunity to speak to Bill C-42 as well. But the most worrisome aspect of this bill, to my mind, is the regulations. Now, I won't take anything away from any of my colleagues. I'm not an expert on firearms. Now, I know that I don't want dangerous weapons in the hands of criminals, but as I said, collectors, and hunters and fishers who are law-abiding, I don't have a problem with that. But where I do have a problem is with respect to the regulations. Because oftentimes what happens, and we've seen this at the Justice Committee before, is that bills are adopted and they go through so quickly, and the Conservatives have put forth so many justice bills, for example, and public safety bills, that people in the Department of Justice haven't even had the time to really analyze all of the ins and outs of each of those bills, to analyze them. And now I'm not saying that they don't do their jobs well. It's just there's a limit to. Now, if I were a legal reviser and I had 500 or 50 files to do in 1 week, well, I would do my best and try to, as I said, do my best. So they're on a mission. But in that kind of a context, oftentimes when we ask them questions, well, what is the link? And this week I asked what the link was between Bill C-536 and the Life Means Life bill with respect to the conditional release. I asked if there wasn't a problem with respect to contradictions, etc. And they have said that clearly that could cause some problems in the courts. And the same thing is here, given the high number of bills on firearms, etc. There are regulations, and there's another bill that will be debated in short order. It's S2, and I would draw your attention to that because it will change ways that we adopt regulations. Now, I call it a sleeper bill, the sleeper bill of this Parliament. It has dire consequences because without realizing it, the government could delegate authority to a minister to change regulations. Now, I'm not saying that this will happen. I'm saying that it's a possibility. But no one can answer my question. When I asked if S2 or what impact S2 would have on the classification of weapons, for example, or firearms under this bill, C-42. Now, I'm not concerned about the government here because a government that is sensible and taking steps for the well-being, common well-being, public safety, I don't have a concern at that level. But when there's a government that marches in line step with the lobbyists, and our critic for public safety raised a question with the minister, and the writing name is so difficult for a francophone to pronounce. But at any rate, there was a link between the fact that some groups weren't at committee on Bill C-51, the Anti-Terrorism Act, and it was quite strange that that bill and the previous Conservative colleague who spoke before me has been here for a long time. Well, it was supposed to be addressed or debated on the 23rd of October, and I was preparing to study it when the incident occurred on Parliament Hill. And as ironic as it is, a bill that was going to be improving public safety, with the minister has put forth this piece of legislation, but it's so good for public safety that the day after a shootout, they could have introduced Bill C-42, and as a good, responsible government, we could have debated it and adopted it quickly because it's good for public safety. That could have been their logic, but no, they knew that there were major problems with it. They're going to be opening everything up, increasing access, and that might bother Canadians. And as they looked at the polls at the time, they withdrew it and waited until what? Well, the speeches were made by the minister and the critics, and then they cut off debate. And now it's April 1st. This isn't an April Fool's joke. It's been brought back, and it's been dragging on for 6 months. Well, that's not my fault. It's been dragging on. They're the ones in charge of that. But there are a number of points in this bill that are very worrisome, Mr. Speaker. But what I'm saying to colleagues, and I know that this will pay dividends for them. I know they make a lot of money and a lot of capital on this. When they scrapped the registry, they collected some money. Now they can continue, and they'll say the member for Gatineau opposes hunters and fishers, but that's not true. I'm sick and tired of hearing ridiculous comments like that. So can we have some adult-level speeches on this issue? Can we simply make sure that people, law-abiding citizens, have weapons, not criminals? I've never heard anyone on this side say that the firearms registry would have prevented the Polytechnic incident. But that's what people are saying in investigations. And But had the information been out there, but maybe different action could have been taken. But having said all of that, we need to take measures for public safety, not simply to fund or to line the coffers of the Conservative Party of Canada.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Prince George, Peace River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the person across the way. At length I listened and I waited to hear what actual opposition she had to the actual regulations. She kept referring to regulations, that she had a problem with regulations and had a problem with regulations. But after 20 minutes, I haven't heard one regulation specified that she has a problem with. So I hear a lot of rhetoric and a lot of bluster, but I haven't heard a lot of specifics. And seeing that she's accusing us of not giving us enough, or not giving her enough time, and the opposition party to have enough time to debate the bill, you think that she would use the time more wisely and get specific with what her problems with the bill are. So I just would ask her to be specific. What specific issues do you have with the bill? Thank you.
The honourable member for Gatineau. Well, his question is so vague and general. He probably didn't even listen very carefully to my remarks, because regulations, the way that one of the deregulation measures included in this bill is something that's is a problem now. I don't sit on the Public Safety Committee, but if I were to sit on that committee, that would be one of the aspects that I would look into very carefully. My objection was a general objection to the way the government, to the action or the approach the government is taking with respect to this division between them and us, because where there can't be any agreement on certain aspects. Now, the Conservative member from Toronto, well, there are not very many, and there won't be very many after the election in 2015, October 2015, but those people have the same concerns as my colleagues. They're all concerned about these issues, and in the rural ridings as well. We have rural ridings in Quebec, and we're concerned. And in fact, I don't even have to go into a rural riding. I've got a large community of hunters in Gatineau who bring me moose steak, for example. Now, I don't accept very large pieces, otherwise I'd have to make a statement with the Commissioner of Ethics. But at any rate, well, these are the reasons why there are problems in this in the Parliament here, because they're not listening to what the people are saying, and for them to divide groups and to create wedge issues is their approach, and we won't take any lessons from them.
Come on, side. The honourable member for Trinity, Spadina.
I guess my question to the member is this. The party opposite wanted a conversation about a regulation which raises concerns. The regulation changing, displacing police officers as the people and chief firearms officers as the experts who will decide on which guns are safe and which guns are not safe, displacing that and putting a political person in charge. This is the same party that said that your party, the official opposition, denigrated police forces when they said their expertise couldn't be trusted. This is the same party that has said that when it comes to police officers, they are the highest authority when it comes to public safety. What are your concerns about giving a political minister the right to legalize a weapon instead of giving the police departments and the firearms officers, the provinces, the right to make that determination?
The honourable member for Gatineau.
That they're to address their questions and comments to the chair, not to individual members of Parliament. Deputy.
The honourable member.
Mr. Speaker, and when I was talking about different trends that are worrying me, and using my expertise, I think, and I hope, as justice critic for the official opposition, and that's the benefit that I would have hoped the Minister of Public Security would have been interested in. It's one thing to know that people will vote against or for. It's another thing to know why. And there's multiple reasons. We've got the reasoning of our public security critic. There's other consideration for other members, different aspect. I've got colleagues who are really involved in, I'm not saying I'm not involved with First Nations, but it's more predominant in their writings. They're acutely aware of their needs and so on. And Mine is justice, and in looking in different bills and seeing similitude in this bill with some of the bills that I have to analyze and discuss at committee at justice. The fact that we're giving powers, more and more powers, that used to be with experts like police, to politicians. Mind you, even if I was the minister, I don't want that power. Leave it in the hands of the specialists. And we see that. We see that in C-53 with the life means life thing, where we're going to give the same Minister of Public Security, thank God won't happen under him, but the possibility to decide if somebody, are they getting out or not. So, I mean, there's a danger there. There's a danger there. And with S2, I'm saying he wanted something precise. Go read I hope he reads S2, Mr. Speaker, because it's a bill, like I said, a sleeper bill that has an impact on all of these bills. These guys know what they're doing, and they're just undermining democracy, and that is a danger. And if we don't stand up in our place to go against it, one day when we'll have nothing to do and we'll all stay home because who cares? We don't need to vote. We don't need to do anything.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Very quickly, I've listened to the incoherent words of the member because she's confused about who's opposed to this bill. This bill would simplify the licensing regime, and we will have measures to strengthen safety. How can the member oppose mandatory training and taking away licenses from those who are found guilty of domestic violence? Is she ready to strengthen safety and have an efficient licensing regime and fix the mistakes for hunters who were victims of what happened in the 1990s? She has the chance to act in supporting this bill. I'd like to hear from her. The Honourable Member for Gatineau. Well, I can say, Mr. Speaker, the NRA, well, the gun lobby, no, you, the minister, mentioned the NRA, and I don't know what was up with that, but I'll let it go. The bill itself, what they want is for everybody to walk around with a gun. As long as the Conservative government doesn't do that, they are going to disappoint the lobby. When they read, and my colleague from Winnipeg North mentioned this, the article from Evan Dyer, which was published in November, which noted that many of their fans in the firearm file were disappointed that things weren't going quickly enough, that things weren't going far enough. Well, I'd be surprised to hear them appear at committee to say they're against this bill. Maybe they'll say that it doesn't go far enough. We've already seen that in other committees. That having been said, there are maybe a few sentences, maybe a few sections that are good. Well, the Conservatives are good at saying, hey, there's a good element here, and how can you vote against that? But what they're not saying is that there are dangerous elements to this bill, and elements in this bill which are good in theory, but the impact that they will have in small communities might create certain problems. If I had assurances from the minister, but the minister doesn't want to listen to us here, if I had assurances from the minister that he would listen to what happens in committee, that we might be able to improve the bill, then maybe we could get a great result from the committee study. But I'm waiting with a lot of optimism, but not a lot of hope. A lot of optimism, though, to see what the committee work achieves.
Questions and comments? The
Honourable Member for Laurentides-Labelle. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The thing that concerns me is that weapons which in the past were classified as restricted, like, for example, the Swiss semi-automatic or fully automatic weapons, are combat weapons, could become available to anyone. I have 6 firearms. They are all registered, and not one of them can shoot more than 3 bullets. That's all that a hunter needs. There's nobody who's going to go hunting moose with an AK-47 that's going to cut the moose in half. That doesn't achieve anything. It's utterly idiotic. And with the bills and with the new reglementation, anything could happen, and that would be absolutely terrible. I'd like to hear my colleague on that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Gatineau. A short answer, please. Well, just a couple of examples to reply to my colleague for his question. I thank him for his question. If we look at this, Bill C-42 gives new power to the Cabinet, which is to change the definition or classification of firearms under Section 44 of the Criminal Code. And so, through regulation, Cabinet could classify as unrestricted firearms which would normally correspond to the definition of prohibited or restricted firearms. And Cabinet could also declare that firearms that would normally be prohibited would be made authorized. So instead of highlighting safety for the public, this bill, C-42, gives Cabinet the power to establish definitions of classifications of firearms. This is a major concern with this bill, Mr. Speaker. There might be one section that refers to family violence, but and the minister knows that, we're fighting very hard to get rid of that scourge, that violence. But to say that to support that clause, we're going to support all of these other clauses, which won't be able to amend in committee because they won't let us, well, that's unfortunate, and it's too bad because we could have done much better with this bill.
Resuming debate. Reprise the débat. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I just want to note that I will be sharing my time this evening, or as the debate goes into the next day. Mr. Speaker, as a member of the Conservative government, I'm very proud to rise and speak today in favour of Bill C-42, the Common Sense Firearms Licensing Act. And as I go through my speech, I think people are going to recognize why it's called just that, because I think that name very appropriately reflects all the very important measures that are within this bill. And it should be no surprise to anyone that our government has chosen to champion this bill. We have always been the only Canadian party to believe in a common sense approach to public safety. Criminals and not law-abiding persons should face repercussions in the justice system. This bill will make several much-needed amendments to do just that. Mr. Speaker, the bill has 8 components that take a safe and sensible approach to firearms heritage in Canada. It contains elements to target violent criminal behaviour. This bill will also reduce the burden on those law-abiding Canadians who wish to enjoy the use of their property by cutting red tape. I would like to take the opportunity to outline some of the measures I think particularly beneficial to all Canadians, in addition to some which will benefit law-abiding hunters, farmers, and sports shooters specifically. And Mr. Speaker, as we have this debate, I think it's important to recognize I grew up in an urban setting, and had I never moved to a rural community, I perhaps wouldn't have understood this bill as much as I do, having had the enormous privilege and opportunity to live in a rural area for many years. Hunting was not part of my life growing up, nor was sports shooting. When I moved to a rural community, one of the things that happened very early on was I hit a deer with my car in the middle of a very isolated area. The deer was severely injured on the side of the road, and it was a person that came by not too long after that managed to put this deer out of its misery with his rifle. It was a few years later. My children were born in a rural community, and we lived on some acreage. The neighbor next door, there was a cougar stalking our children, and he shot that cougar, and thankfully none of our children were impacted. So I really learned to appreciate in my rural time how the hunters, the farmers, it was a tool. And it was really, again, as we so often say, law-abiding hunters and farmers that were getting buried in red tape. So I think, again, Mr. Speaker, I maybe appreciate how some of the folks from the urban areas might not understand this bill, but I think we should all agree with the principles of reducing red tape and, of course, some of the protection measures that are going to go into place. So, Mr. Speaker, let's look at the facts. Enjoying a hobby such as sport shooting or utilizing firearms as a part of your livelihood does not make you a criminal, nor does it in any logical way predict your likelihood to commit a crime. And again, I think I gave you two very important examples. That is why, Mr. Speaker, that this bill will create a 6-month grace period for license renewal at the end of the 5-year license period. You cannot use your firearms or purchase ammunition with an expired license, but you will not be treated like a criminal because you made an honest mistake. And I think who amongst us here has not perhaps missed a renewal of your car insurance or some other type of insurance system that's important? So I think to suggest that this has a little bit of a grace period is very appropriate, and any reasonable, sensible person should agree. Possession-only license will be eliminated, converting to the possession and acquisition license, giving the right to purchase firearms to all who hold a valid POL. And again, when I learned about the system that we had in place, I was actually quite flabbergasted in terms of the POL and the PAL and the firearms registry. It really, truly seemed like a system that was buried in red tape. We're not talking about reducing safety. We're talking about reducing a system that is buried in red tape. Mr. Speaker, that means 600,000 Canadians who have owned and used firearms safely, many for more than 20 years, will now be trusted to purchase new firearms if they wish. Safe and sensible, as they have safely used firearms for years. Again, I think any reasonable person would agree. This bill proposes that first-time firearms owners must attend firearms training prior to issuing a license. Safe, sensible. This bill proposes to create firearms prohibition orders against those who commit domestic violence, punishing criminal actions versus those who stay within the law. I find it very difficult to understand again why people across the floor could possibly oppose this bill. Though I must say, again, I'm not really all that surprised because I've seen so many times, and again, the long gun registry, and I look at some of the NDP who represent rural communities, and I know that they are voting against the wishes of their constituents. When they voted to keep the long gun registry, when they vote, presumably, hopefully they'll support us, but if they vote against this, they are voting against the wishes of the majority of their constituents, and those NDP in particular should be very concerned in terms of they're not representing who they've been sent here to represent. Today, Mr. Speaker, if a law-abiding gun owner wants to get their restricted firearm repaired for a day at the range next week, they could not. And I'll tell you why. It's because they would have to submit a piece of paperwork to the Ontario CFO's office to get a letter authorizing them to transport it to that location, even if they have a piece of paperwork signed by them saying they can take it to their local range. Mr. Speaker, that is simply nonsense. If you have a license and you want to take it to a licensed armorer, is it really a risk to public safety if you transport the firearm in a locked case with a trigger lock on the firearm out of arm's reach as required by law? If it really were a risk to public safety, then why, after waiting several weeks or more for a piece of paperwork from the CFO, is it now somehow made safe? If the CFO thought someone was unsafe, he should never have approved the license in the first place. The entire process, Mr. Speaker, is nonsense. The government's bill is going to address this as well. As a firearms owner, one is already subject to continuous eligibility screening. This means your license is checked against the police information system to see if you've committed a crime. This bill, Mr. Speaker, proposes to end needless paperwork around authorization to transport restricted firearms by making them a condition of a restricted license for routine and lawful activities. CFOs that approve licenses for a firearms owner will now also be approving the legal use of those firearms at the same time. This bill will end the arbitrary discretion of the Chief Firearms Officer, No longer will they be able to create regulations which are deliberately infringe on the enjoyment of property without a legitimate public safety need. Mr. Speaker, I believe that I'm coming close to the ends of my speaking time, so I'll head into my last remarks. This bill is going to make two extremely important amendments which will benefit many Canadians. One is that the bill proposes to end the loophole which stops information sharing between law enforcement agencies when investigating the importation of illegal handguns. And the final change proposed in this bill is to put the final say on the classification of firearms in the hands of the elected government after receiving professional advice on the characteristics of the firearm. These last two changes will end bureaucratic nonsense. And I keep using that word because you can see how bogged down the red tape is. Yes, we need to worry about safety. Yes, we need to worry about proper training. But no, we don't need to have paperwork after paperwork after paperwork. So really, Mr. Speaker, I believe at its core in protecting Canada's heritage, hunters, farmers, and sports shooters are at that very core of Canadian heritage and deserve representation against false perceptions that are being propagated in this House, and certainly we have heard many of them already. You are not a criminal in this country just because you own a firearm, nor should you be made a criminal through fear-mongering. On this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, we will always stand up for safe and sensible firearms policy. And again, I think if you look at those points that I brought up, those 8 points, they are really reducing red tape, increasing safety measures. They're sensible, they're appropriate, and I suggest that all members on both sides of the House should seriously consider supporting this bill.
Order. À l'ordre. It being 6 p.m., the House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on motion M533 under private members' business in the name of Mr. Genet Jourdain. Call in the members. Convoquez les députés.